Hello, I'm Jennifer. Welcome to another episode of Case Brief, brought to you by the Missouri Sheriff's Association. Before we get started, I want to remind everyone that this information is for training purposes only and in no way is to be considered legal advice. Today, we focus on an Eighth Circuit court case related to handcuffing a person when they are simply being detained and are not under arrest. Our goal is to provide a clear understanding of how such cases unfold. Remember, this content is educational and not legal advice, so let's dive into the details. After receiving community complaints about drug activity and other crimes, the summer enforcement team sent the 3 officers to the neighborhood to investigate. Dressed in plain clothes in an unmarked van, Officer Garrett kept lookout while Officers Minnehan and Steinkamp patrolled in a cruiser. If Garrett suspected criminal activity, he would tell Minnehan and Steinkamp. Then they would follow up on leads. Garrett saw a person on the sidewalk approach the Volkswagen's passenger's side window. The officer saw a 10 to 15-second meeting that involved an exchange of something between them, based on his training, experience, and nature of the crimes reported in the neighborhood. Among other things, Garrett believed that this interaction might have been an illegal drug transaction. Garrett trailed the car and told Steinkamp and Minnehan that he suspected a hand-to-hand drug deal. Steinkamp and Minnehan followed the car. When the car stopped at a stop sign, the officers activated their lights. The officers did not radio the stop to dispatch. Body cam and dash cam videos captured what happened next. After stopping his car, Haynes turned his head toward the officers and stuck his palms outside the driver's side window to show that his hands were empty. Approaching the car from the back, Steinkamp headed to the driver's side and Minnehan to the passenger's side. Steinkamp asked, "What were you doing?" Haynes explained that he had just given some change away. When Steinkamp asked for identification, Haynes asked for permission to look for it, but Haynes could not locate his license. So, he gave Steinkamp a Visa credit card and a Costco card. Both cards bore his name, and the Costco card showed his photograph. Steinkamp jotted down Haynes's social security number, his birth date, and his address. Haynes also handed his insurance card to Minnehan. That card correctly listed Haynes's name. Nothing about Haynes's behavior led them to see him as a safety risk or uncooperative. Both officers looked into the car. Neither saw anything drug-related nor smelled marijuana, and neither saw weapons. Steinkamp's training taught him to look for suspicious mannerisms like heavy breathing, sweating, and fluctuation in the carotid artery. He saw none in Haynes. Instead, Haynes's cooperativeness led Steinkamp to immediately realize that this was gonna be a pretty quick stop. And Minnehan characterized Haynes as extremely cooperative, very relaxed, polite, and pleasant. But because Haynes did not have his license, Steinkamp asked Haynes to step out of his car. When Haynes complied, Steinkamp stated, "I'm going to detain you right now because I don't know who you are." Steinkamp then handcuffed Haynes. Both officers would later testify that if a driver lacked identification during a traffic stop, as a standard practice, the officers would handcuff the driver. Minnehan, meanwhile, asked Haynes if he had anything illegal on him or in the car. Haynes said that he did not. Minnehan told Haynes that the handcuffing stemmed from his missing license and his presence in a high-crime area. Haynes remarked, "The car and me being over here don't match." Minnehan responded that, "It's a nice car for the area." Then Steinkamp began a pat-down while asking again if Haynes had anything illegal on him. When Steinkamp asked to do a pocket check, Haynes consented. Steinkamp checked Haynes's left and right-hand jeans pockets, patted down the area between his legs and the front of his pants. During the frisk, Minnehan offered another explanation for the handcuffing and frisking, that he had seen probably 75 hand-to-hand sales of crack at the same spot. Steinkamp asked if Haynes had another pair of pants underneath his jeans. In his affirmative response, Haynes offered to let Steinkamp undo his belt and check the pockets. Steinkamp did and did not find any drugs or weapons. Steinkamp headed back to the cruiser. With Steinkamp back at the cruiser, Minnehan watched over Haynes, who stood in the road in full public view in handcuffs, with his belt unbuckled and his pants unzipped. Minnehan again asked if Haynes had anything illegal in the car. As Haynes said that he did not, he invited Minnehan to search the car. Minnehan declined. Over 2 minutes later, Steinkamp returned and stated, "We're good." Then Minnehan finally removed the handcuffs. From the time the pat-down ended until Haynes was uncuffed was nearly 5 minutes. Haynes sued alleging federal and state constitutional violations. The officers, the city and Wingert, moved for summary judgment on qualified immunity grounds. The district court granted that motion for summary judgment. It reasoned that Haynes had no clearly established right to be free of handcuffs post-frisk, and it concluded that the record did not show a longer than necessary stop. It dismissed Haynes's Monell claims for failure to train and supervise as without merit, given its conclusions on the alleged constitutional violations. To determine if the officers should receive qualified immunity, the court examined 2 factors. 1. Do the facts, viewed in the light most favorable to Haynes, show that the officers deprived him of a constitutional or statutory right? And 2, was that right clearly established when the alleged deprivation occurred? The Fourth Amendment bars unreasonable seizures. A seizure occurs if, in view of all of the circumstances surrounding the incident, a reasonable person would have believed that he was not free to leave. An officer can conduct a brief investigatory stop, often referred to as a Terry stop, when the officer has a reasonable, articulable suspicion that criminal activity is afoot. A lawful investigative stop may nonetheless violate the Fourth Amendment if it is excessively intrusive in its scope or manner of execution. Because Haynes did not challenge the stop itself, the Eighth Circuit Court focused its attention on the scope and manner in which the officers carried out the stop. When considering the manner in which a stop is carried out, the court has held that officers may use handcuffs as a reasonable precaution to protect the officer's safety and maintain the status quo during the stop. But because handcuffs constitute greater than a de minimis intrusion, their use requires the officer to demonstrate that the facts available to the officer would warrant a man of reasonable caution in believing that the action taken was appropriate. In particular, Terry requires some reasonable belief that the suspect is armed and dangerous, or that the restraints are necessary for some other legitimate purpose, evaluated on the facts of each case. And the Eighth Circuit Court has already held that handcuffing, absent any concern for safety, violates the manner and scope component of the Terry decision. The court found that under the circumstances of this case, the officers failed to point to specific facts supporting an objective safety concern during the encounter. As a result, the court concluded that the officers' conduct was not reasonably necessary to protect their personal safety or maintain the status quo during the investigatory stop. And therefore, the way that the officers conducted the seizure was not reasonably related in scope to the circumstances which justified the interference in the first place. More than 6 years before Steinkamp handcuffed Haynes, the court said that it was well established that if suspects are cooperative and officers have no objective concerns for safety, the officers may not use intrusive tactics such as handcuffing absent any extraordinary circumstances. The court found that prior case law provided fair warning to an officer at the time of this incident, that a reasonable officer in their place could not have believed it was lawful to handcuff and frisk a suspect absent any concern for safety. And for these reasons, the Eighth Circuit Court reversed the summary judgment and remanded the case to the district court for proceedings consistent with their opinion. As we begin to wrap up, I want to review a few critical points to ensure we understand the legal framework and best practices. The court found that under the circumstances of this case, the officers failed to point to specific facts supporting an objective safety concern during the encounter. So, what facts worked against the officers in this case? The court referenced United States versus Johnson, where the court recognizes the connection between weapons and drug deals, and that the court has repeatedly equated a person's suspected drug deal involvement with a reasonable belief that the same person may be armed and dangerous. But as new information flows in, a reasonable belief can dissolve into an unreasonable one. That's what happened in this case. The officers gained additional information about Haynes by what he shared: his name, address, social security number, his Costco card with his photo, his Visa credit card, and his insurance card. And they gained information about him by observing how he acted: cooperative, polite, and relaxed. They also gained information about Haynes by what they did not see: drugs or weapons, find, drugs or weapons, or smell, drugs. The officers chose not to gather extra information from readily available sources like searching Haynes's extra pocket and his car. From the start, the officers outnumbered Haynes, who neither officer described as a large or imposing figure. They experienced no visibility issues. At no point did they seek help by contacting dispatch. And when unsolicited help arrived, another cruiser that asked if they needed anything, to which they replied that they were all good, they sent it away. Yet, the officers kept Haynes in handcuffs in the road with his belt unbuckled and his pants unzipped for over 5 minutes. And Officer Minnehan told Haynes that the handcuffing stemmed from his missing license and his presence in a high-crime area. Both officers testified that if a driver lacked identification during a traffic stop, as a standard practice, the officers would handcuff the driver. Their supervisor, Sergeant Jeffrey Robinson, testified that, typically, an officer would handcuff an individual during every Terry frisk. Standard practice must be constitutional, and handcuffing everyone who simply does not have or does not produce identification per se is not constitutional. An officer can conduct a brief investigative stop when the officer has a reasonable, articulable suspicion that criminal activity is afoot. See Terry versus Ohio. The U.S. Supreme Court also held in Terry that police have the right, if they have reasonable suspicion that a suspect might be armed and dangerous, to conduct a pat-down search of the suspect for weapons. However, the court also made it clear that the justification for stopping a person does not automatically justify a search. In order to conduct a frisk, pat-down for weapons, the officer must have separate and additional reasonable suspicion that the person is armed and dangerous. The purpose of the frisk is not to search for evidence of a crime, but rather to ensure officer safety by checking for weapons. As we wrap up, let's take a look at an example where the stop does not justify a search, compared to an example where the stop also justifies a search. Where the stop does not justify a search. An officer observes a man standing outside a closed store late at night, repeatedly looking around and appearing to check the door handle. The officer stops the man to investigate possible burglary-related activity. However, the man is cooperative and does not make any movements suggesting he has a weapon. In this case, the officer has reasonable suspicion to stop the man to question him about the possible burglary. However, the officer does not automatically have reasonable suspicion to pat him down for weapons, as there are no articulable facts indicating the man is armed and dangerous. Where the stop also justifies a search. An officer receives a report that a man matching a certain description brandished a firearm at a gas station and left on foot. A few minutes later, the officer spots an individual who fits the description walking away from the gas station. The officer stops the suspect and, based on the nature of the report, involving a weapon, conducts a frisk for weapons. In this case, the reasonable suspicion for the stop is based on the reported crime, brandishing a firearm. The reasonable suspicion for the frisk is justified because the report specifically mentioned a firearm, making it reasonable to believe the suspect is armed and dangerous. This case centered around the scope and manner in which officers carried out an investigative detention, where the court specified many factors leading the court to determine that handcuffing the individual under the circumstances was a constitutional violation. We encourage you to watch our brief on Waters versus Madsen, where the court held that officers could reasonably conclude that Mr. Waters' unpredictable behavior would continue to escalate, and that handcuffing him and briefly placing him in the squad car was the least intrusive means of maintaining the status quo and protecting Mr. Waters, themselves, and bystanders while the officers investigated. Thank you for joining us in this episode of Case Brief. We hope this analysis provided valuable insights into the types of specific factors needed to justify handcuffing a person while being detained as a result of an investigative stop. Stay tuned for more episodes brought to you by the Missouri Sheriff's Association. If you enjoyed this content, please like and subscribe. We look forward to bringing you more informative episodes in the future.